There is something quietly wrong about this photograph. It was taken from a helicopter on April 20th, 2007, somewhere between the Australian mainland and the outer edge of the Great Barrier Reef. The water beneath is that particular shade of blue that appears only in expensive travel brochures. The sky is postcard perfect. And there, in the center of the frame, is a 9.8-meter catamaran. White hulls, sails deployed. The vessel moves through the water with what appears to be purpose, as if someone is still steering. But no one is. The crew is gone. Vanished somewhere between departure and discovery, leaving behind a scene so undisturbed that investigators would later struggle to explain what they were looking at. This is the story of the ghost yacht that sailed away without its crew. The strange mystery of the Kaz II. We're going to cover everything. Who these men were, what they were searching for, the vessel they trusted with their lives, the days before they vanished, what was found aboard when rescuers arrived, and the evidence that points in directions no one wants to follow. Everyone was accounted for when they left. Nothing was accounted for when they were found. So I ask you, did the ocean take them by accident, or did something else happen in those final hours that no one was meant to survive? Derek Batten was 56 years old when he bought the catamaran. He had worked most of his adult life in Perth, building a modest but comfortable existence, the kind that allowed for dreams of early retirement and long sails up the Queensland coast. He was not a professional sailor. He was not reckless. He was simply a man who had earned the right to a little adventure, and who believed that the ocean, if treated with respect, would return the favor. The Tunstead brothers were his neighbors. Peter was 69. James was 63. They had known Derek for years, shared dinners, traded stories over backyard barbecues, the kind of slow-building friendship that comes from proximity and mutual decency. When Derek mentioned his plan to sail north, to spend weeks drifting along the reef with nothing but time and good weather, the brothers asked if they could join him. Derek said yes. It was not a decision made lightly. A boat, even a comfortable one, becomes a very small world when you share it with others. But these were men who understood each other's rhythms. They were not strangers. They were not thrill seekers. They were retirees looking for something quieter than excitement. A change of scenery. A few weeks away from the ordinary. The Kaz II was registered in Derek's name. He had outfitted it carefully over the months leading up to the trip, stocking it with fishing gear, provisions, charts, and a modest collection of navigation electronics. The boat was not new, but it was well maintained. Derek took pride in that. He understood that at sea, small oversights become large problems, so he checked the engine, inspected the rigging, ensured the safety equipment was in order. He did everything a responsible skipper should do. And on the 15th of April, 2007, the three men departed Airlie Beach, Queensland, heading north under clear skies. They were expected to check in regularly. They were expected to follow the coast at a leisurely pace, stopping when they felt like it, fishing when the mood struck. There was no rigid schedule, no pressure. Just the open water and the promise of warm days. 5 days later, the Kaz II was found drifting off the Great Barrier Reef. Empty, intact, and impossibly, inexplicably abandoned. The catamaran itself was a study in modest luxury. Not ostentatious, but comfortable in the way that matters when you plan to live aboard for weeks at a time. Twin hulls, each just under 5 meters wide, connected by a spacious deck and a compact cabin. The design was stable, forgiving in rough water, ideal for coastal cruising. It weighed approximately 2.8 metric tons when fully loaded, light enough to be maneuverable, heavy enough to handle a swell. The interior was efficient. A small galley kitchen on the port side, fitted with a 2-burner stove, a sink, and a modest refrigerator that ran off the boat's 12-volt system. Storage lockers lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, dried pasta, rice, enough food for 3 men to eat well for a month if they needed to. There was a navigation station tucked into a corner near the helm, equipped with a laptop computer running basic chart software, a VHF radio, and a GPS unit that logged the boat's position every few minutes. The sleeping quarters were simple. 2 small cabins, each with a narrow bunk and just enough headroom to sit upright. The Tunstead brothers shared one. Derek took the other. Privacy was minimal, but that was understood. On a boat this size, you learn to move around each other, to respect the small silences, to not ask too many questions when someone steps out on deck for air. The deck itself was open, uncluttered. A small table bolted near the stern, where the men could sit and eat when the weather was calm. Stainless steel railings ran along the edges, waist high, sturdy enough to hold onto in rough seas, but low enough that a man could lean over them to reach a fishing line or adjust a fender. The helm was positioned amidships, sheltered by a small bimini canopy that offered shade but little protection from wind or spray. The controls were straightforward. Throttle, steering wheel, a few gauges for engine temperature, fuel levels, battery charge. Nothing complicated, nothing that required years of experience to operate. The sails were standard for a vessel of this size. A mainsail and a jib, both rigged to be raised and lowered from the cockpit. The mast was aluminum, approximately 12 meters tall, fitted with stainless steel standing rigging and halyards made of braided polyester. The sails themselves were Dacron, durable, and relatively easy to handle, though like all sails they required attention in shifting wind. A sudden gust could catch them badly if the sheets were not adjusted in time. A mishandled tack could shred a panel if the sail flogged too hard against the rigging. The engine was a small diesel, reliable and efficient, capable of pushing the catamaran at a steady 6 knots in calm water. It was mounted below deck, accessible through a hatch in the cabin floor, and it ran with the kind of low, steady hum that becomes part of the background when you live on a boat. You stop noticing it after a while. It becomes the sound of normalcy. The sound of things working as they should. The Kaz II was not a wealthy man's yacht. It was not fitted with marble countertops or leather upholstery, but it was comfortable. It was seaworthy. And for 3 men who simply wanted to sail north and enjoy themselves, it was more than enough. They left Airlie Beach in the mid-morning, motoring out past the marina breakwater and into the open water beyond. The weather was clear. The wind was light from the southeast, steady and predictable. Conditions that any coastal cruiser would welcome. Derek took the helm for the first few hours, steering them north along the coast, while Peter and James settled into the rhythm of life aboard. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a boat once it is underway. The engine hums. The water hisses along the hulls. Gulls circle for a while and then lose interest. The land recedes slowly, becoming a smudge of green and brown on the horizon, and then it is gone entirely, leaving only water and sky. Derek had planned the route carefully. They would stay within sight of the coast for the first few days, stopping at small anchorages along the way, places where they could drop anchor, swim, fish, and sleep without the motion of the open ocean beneath them. It was meant to be leisurely. There was no reason to rush. The first day passed without incident. They motored north for several hours, then cut the engine and raised the sails to take advantage of the afternoon breeze. The catamaran responded smoothly, heeling slightly as the wind filled the canvas, and for a while they simply sat in the cockpit and watched the coastline slide past. Peter was the quieter of the 2 brothers. He spent much of that first day on the foredeck, watching the water, occasionally pointing out a pod of dolphins that surfaced alongside the boat and kept pace for a few minutes before disappearing again. James was more talkative, more likely to joke about the size of the fish they would catch or the quality of the wine they had brought along. He helped Derek with the sails, learning the names of the lines, the rhythm of trimming the sheets when the wind shifted. They anchored that first night in a sheltered bay, the the kind of place where the water turns glassy and still once the wind dies down. They ate dinner on deck as the sun set. Grilled fish, rice, a bottle of red wine that Peter had insisted on bringing despite Derek's protests about limited storage space. The conversation was easy. There was laughter. There was the kind of comfort that comes from being in the right place, with the right people, at the right time. The boat rocked gently beneath them, responding to the slight current that moved through the anchorage. Above, the stars came out in numbers you never see from shore, bright and dense and impossibly clear. Derek checked the anchor before turning in for the night, making sure it was set properly, that the boat would not drift while they slept. Everything was secure. Everything was as it should be. The second day began, much like the first. They woke early, brewed coffee on the galley stove, and pulled up the anchor as the sun climbed over the horizon. The plan was to continue north, to cover perhaps 20 or 30 nautical miles before stopping again for the night. There was no urgency, no schedule to keep. The routine began to establish itself. Derek took the helm in the mornings, steering them out of whatever anchorage they had chosen the night before and setting a course northward. Peter and James took turns preparing meals, cleaning up, managing the small tasks that keep a boat running smoothly. They fished off the stern when the mood struck, trailing lines behind the boat and waiting for the telltale tug that meant something had taken the bait. They did not catch much, but that did not seem to matter. The act of fishing was enough. By the third day, they had settled into a kind of rhythm. They knew when to raise the sails and when to rely on the engine. They knew which cupboards held the food and which held the spare lines and tools. They knew how to move around each other in the small space of the cabin without bumping elbows or getting in each other's way. The ocean was kind to them. The wind remained steady. The seas stayed calm. They saw other boats from time to time, distant white shapes on the horizon, but for the most part, they had the water to themselves. It was the kind of sailing that Derek had imagined when he bought the boat. Quiet, peaceful. A world reduced to wind and water and the slow passage of time. But the ocean is not always kind. And the men aboard the Kaz II, for all their preparation, were not experienced enough to recognize the small signs that conditions were beginning to change. On the 18th of April, the wind began to shift. It was subtle at first, a change in direction, the breeze swinging around from the east instead of the southeast. Nothing alarming, nothing that suggested danger, but it meant the sails needed adjusting, and adjusting sails requires attention. Derek noticed it first. He was at the helm, watching the telltales flutter along the edge of the jib, and he called back to James to ease the sheet slightly, to let the sail out a few inches so it would catch the new angle of the wind. James did as he was told, but the sail flogged for a moment, snapping loudly against the rigging before it filled again. It is a sound that every sailor knows. The crack of canvas against metal. It means something is wrong. Either the sail is trimmed incorrectly, or the wind has shifted faster than expected, or the helmsman is not steering a steady course. It is not inherently dangerous, but it is a warning. A reminder that the boat and the wind are engaged in a constant negotiation, and that negotiation requires vigilance. Derek corrected the course. The sail settled. The flogging stopped. But later that afternoon, it happened again. This time, the mainsail. A sudden gust caught it badly, and before anyone could react, the sail began to flog violently, the boom swinging across the deck and the entire rig shuddering under the strain. Derek shouted for Peter to release the mainsheet, to let the sail out completely and spill the wind. But Peter hesitated, unsure which line to pull. And in those few seconds, the sail tore. Not badly, just a small rip along one of the seams, perhaps 1/2 meter long. But it was enough. Enough to weaken the sail. Enough to change the way it behaved in the wind, and enough to remind all 3 men that they were not as competent as they had believed. They brought the sail down and inspected the damage. Derek thought they could repair it with duct tape and a needle, But the fabric was old, and the tear was in a place that took most of the strain. He decided to leave the mainsail down for the time being and continue under engine power until they could find a sheltered spot to make a proper repair. The wind continued to build through the afternoon. Not dangerously, but enough to make the water choppy, to send small waves slapping against the hulls, to create a rhythm of motion that was less comfortable than the glassy calm of the previous days. They were approximately 50 kilometers offshore by then, farther from land than they had been at any point in the journey. The coast was still visible, a low grey line on the western horizon, but it felt distant, remote. The kind of distance that reminds you how small a boat is and how large the ocean. Peter suggested they turn back toward shore, find an anchorage, and wait for the wind to calm before continuing. Derek considered it, but the forecast he had checked that morning had not mentioned any significant weather, just a shift in wind direction. Nothing to worry about. So they pressed on, motoring north under engine power, the torn mainsail bundled on the deck, waiting to be repaired. It was a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. It was also the last decision Derek Batten would ever make. We do not know, with certainty, what happened next. We have only the evidence, the position of the boat when it was found, the state of the cabin, the missing dinghy, the shredded sail, the engine still running. And from these fragments, investigators would later attempt to reconstruct the final hours aboard the Kaz II. To imagine the sequence of events that led 3 men to vanish from a perfectly serviceable vessel in the middle of a calm afternoon. But imagination is not fact, and the ocean does not leave witnesses. What follows is the most likely scenario, the one that fits the evidence. The one that explains, as much as anything can explain, how a boat continues sailing while its crew drowns behind it. The fishing line was trailing off the stern. It had been there since morning, a simple setup with a lure and a weight, dragging through the water behind the catamaran as they motored north. This was not serious fishing. This was the kind of lazy, optimistic fishing that happens when you have time and nothing else to do. You set the line and forget about it. And if something bites, you consider it a bonus. Sometime in the late afternoon of April 18th, something bit. Or perhaps the line snagged on debris. Or perhaps it tangled in the boat's own wake, wrapping around itself in a way that happens more often than it should. The exact cause does not matter. What matters is that the line went taut, and someone noticed. James, most likely. He was the one who enjoyed fishing the most, who checked the line regularly, who talked about catching something large enough to grill for dinner. He would have felt the rod bend, would have grabbed it instinctively, expecting the thrill of a fish on the other end. But the line did not give. It simply pulled, hard and constant, as if hooked on something immovable. James would have tried to reel it in. When that failed, he would have called to Peter or Derek for help, and one of them, probably Peter, would have come to the stern to assist, to see if they could free whatever had snagged the line without cutting it. This is how accidents begin. Not with dramatic failure, but with small problems that seem manageable. A snagged line. A man leaning over the rail, trying to reach the tangle in the water. Another man holding his waist, anchoring him, while the boat continues to move forward at 6 knots. 6 knots is not fast. It is a walking pace, but it is fast enough. The boat hit a wave. Not a large one. Just the kind of chop that had been building all afternoon. The small, irregular swells that come when the wind works against the current. The catamaran lurched slightly, the stern rising and then dropping, and in that moment James lost his balance. He did not fall cleanly. He grabbed at the railing, at Peter, at anything he could reach. But the motion of the boat, the weight of his own body leaning too far forward, the wet deck beneath his feet, all of it conspired against him. He went over the side. Peter shouted, reached for him. Missed! And then Peter made the decision that would kill him. He jumped in after his brother. There is a protocol for man overboard situations. It is taught in every basic sailing course, drilled into students until it becomes automatic. Stop the boat. Throw a life ring. Keep your eyes on the person in the water. Do not, under any circumstances, leave the vessel unless absolutely necessary. Peter Tunstead was 69 years old. He was not a trained sailor. He had probably never attended a formal safety course. And when he saw his brother thrashing in the water, falling behind the boat as it continued to motor forward, he did not think about protocol. He thought about saving James, so he jumped. The water was warm, 24 degrees Celsius, perhaps slightly warmer. Not cold enough to cause immediate shock, but not warm enough to be comfortable for long. Peter surfaced, gasping, disoriented by the sudden immersion, and began swimming toward his brother. James was 10 meters away, then 15. The boat was still moving, pulling steadily away from both of them, and Peter shouted for Derek to stop, to turn around, to throw them something to hold on to. Derek heard him. Derek was still at the helm, still standing in the cockpit where he had been for the past hour, steering the catamaran north. He would have turned when he heard Peter shout, would have seen the empty stern deck, would have realized, in that terrible instant, that both men were now in the water. He throttled back, cut the engine. The boat began to slow, but it did not stop immediately. A 2.8-ton vessel does not stop the moment you cut power. It carries its momentum forward, drifting, pushed by the wind and the waves, and for several seconds it continued to move away from the two men struggling in its wake. Derek did not panic, not yet. He was the skipper. He was responsible, and he knew that the most important thing was to keep the boat under control, to turn it around carefully, to approach the men in the water without running them over. He left the helm and moved to the stern, looking for the life rings. There were 2 of them, bright orange, mounted on brackets near the transom. He grabbed one and threw it as hard as he could in the direction of Peter and James. It fell short. The wind caught it, carried it sideways, and it landed in the water too far away to be useful. Derek threw the second one. This time it went farther, but the men were still out of reach, and the boat was still drifting, slowly but inexorably, away from them. He ran back to the helm, restarted the engine, put it in reverse. The catamaran responded sluggishly. Twin-hulled vessels are not designed to maneuver quickly in reverse. They are stable, forgiving, excellent for coastal cruising, but they do not turn on a dime. Derek spun the wheel, trying to bring the stern around, trying to position the boat so he could approach the men without the wind pushing him past them. But the wind was stronger now, and the current was against him, and Peter and James were no longer visible from the cockpit. He would have had to leave the helm again, had to move to the stern to see where they were, had to shout instructions to them, tell them to swim towards the boat, to grab the life rings, to hold on until he could get close enough to pull them aboard. But the boat was still moving, still drifting, and Derek was alone. The dinghy was stored on the foredeck, a small inflatable with a wooden floor and a single oar. It was tied down with bungee cords, covered with a tarp to protect it from the sun. Derek would have seen it as he moved forward, would have thought that perhaps he could launch it, use it to reach the men in the water, while the catamaran drifted nearby. It was not a bad idea. In theory, it could have worked, but launching a dinghy from a moving boat is not simple. The bungee cords had to be unhooked, the tarp had to be pulled off, the dinghy had to be dragged to the rail and lowered into the water without capsizing it. And all of this had to be done quickly, because Peter and James were getting farther away with every passing second. Derek worked fast, too fast. He fumbled with the cords, yanked the tarp free, and began to drag the dinghy toward the starboard rail. It was heavier than he expected, awkward to maneuver on his own, and the boat was rocking now, the motion less predictable as it wallowed in the waves without forward momentum. He got the dinghy to the rail, began to lift it over the side, and that is when he made his mistake. He leaned too far. put too much weight on the outside of the rail, and the boat, responding to the shift in his center of gravity, rolled slightly toward him. Derek lost his footing. He did not fall cleanly into the dinghy. He fell past it into the water, and the dinghy, no longer held by his hands, slipped over the side and landed upside down beside him. Now all three men were in the water, and the Kaz II, with no one at the helm, continued to drift. We know that the dinghy was never found. We know that the catamaran was discovered 2 days later with its engine in neutral, not off, but idling. We know that the autopilot was engaged, set to a northerly heading, and that the boat had traveled approximately 120 nautical kilometers from the point where investigators believe the men went overboard. We know all of this because the GPS logged it. Because the laptop at the navigation station recorded the boat's position every 15 minutes. Because the engine, designed to run for days without overheating, simply kept running. What we do not know is whether Derek managed to right the dinghy, whether he climbed into it, whether Peter or James reached it before exhaustion took them. The official conclusion, delivered months later by the Queensland coroner, was that the men most likely drowned within hours of entering the water. That despite the warm temperature, despite their efforts to stay afloat, the combination of exhaustion, panic, and the sheer difficulty of treading water in open ocean eventually overcame them. But there are details that do not fit neatly into this conclusion. The dinghy was gone. If it had simply drifted away, empty, it should have been found. Dinghies are buoyant. They do not sink. They wash ashore, or they are spotted by passing vessels, or they turn up weeks later on some distant beach. But this one did not. It vanished as completely as the men. Some investigators suggested that one or more of the men managed to climb into the dinghy, that they attempted to row back toward the coast, and that they were eventually swamped by a wave or capsized in the growing wind. This would explain why the dinghy was never found. A capsized, waterlogged inflatable can sink if it takes on enough water, especially if the wooden floor separates from the fabric hull. But it does not explain the autopilot. The autopilot was a simple device, a small electronic unit connected to the boat's steering system, designed to hold a steady course without constant input from the helmsman. You set the heading, engage the system, and the boat steers itself. It is a convenience feature, common on cruising yachts, useful for long passages when you want to rest or attend to other tasks. Derek would have known how to use it. He had owned the boat for months, had tested all its systems, had motored up and down the coast near Perth to familiarize himself with the controls. But why was it engaged? If Derek was trying to stop the boat, to turn it around, to rescue Peter and James, he would not have engaged the autopilot. He would have left the helm free, would have steered manually, would have kept his hands on the wheel, unless he said it before the men went overboard. This is the detail that haunts the official narrative. The possibility that the autopilot was already engaged when James fell into the water. That the boat was, in fact, sailing itself while all three men fished or attended to the snagged line. That when the emergency began, the catamaran did not need anyone at the helm to continue moving. It would explain why the boat drifted so far, why it maintained a straight northerly course, why it did not circle back toward the men, did not wander aimlessly, did not run aground or collide with the reef. It simply kept going. A perfect heading. 6 knots. North. And the men, watching from the water, would have seen it pull away from them with the kind of mechanical indifference that only an automated system can produce. Peter Tunstead was 69 years old. He was not a strong swimmer. The coroner's report would later note that he suffered from mild arthritis, that his joints were stiff, that prolonged physical exertion would have been difficult for him even under ideal circumstances. He would have tired quickly. James was younger, 63, in better health, but he had been in the water longer. He had gone in first, had used up his initial burst of adrenaline trying to stay afloat while Peter jumped in after him. By the time Derek entered the water, James would have already been struggling. Derek was 56, the youngest of the three, the most physically capable. But he was also the one who had just fallen while trying to launch a dinghy, who had hit the water hard and unexpectedly, who may have injured himself in the fall. None of them were wearing life jackets. This fact appears again and again in the investigative reports, underlined, circled, noted as a critical failure. The boat carried 6 life jackets. They were stored in a locker near the helm, easily accessible, bright yellow and impossible to miss. But none of the men had put them on. It is easy to judge this decision from shore, to ask why they were not wearing safety equipment, why they did not follow basic protocol, why they took such an unnecessary risk. But the answer is simpler than it seems. They did not think they needed them. They were not sailing in a storm. They were not racing. They were motoring along the coast on a calm afternoon, fishing, enjoying the sun, doing exactly what thousands of recreational sailors do every weekend without incident. Life jackets are hot. They are bulky. They restrict movement. And when you are simply sitting in the cockpit, watching a fishing line trail behind the boat, they feel like overkill. So the men did not wear them. And when the emergency began, there was no time to go below and retrieve them. The water is a strange environment. It distorts sound, swallows voices, makes distances impossible to judge. From the surface, a boat 50 meters away looks close enough to reach. But 50 meters is a long swim, especially when you are fully clothed, when the waves are breaking over your head, when your limbs are already heavy with fatigue. Peter would have called to Derek. Derek would have called back. They would have tried to stay together, to keep sight of each other, to coordinate some kind of plan. But the ocean does not care about plans. The current was pushing them east, away from the coast. The wind was pushing them north. And the boat, oblivious and automated, was pulling steadily away on its pre-programmed heading. Within minutes, they would have been separated. Not by much, perhaps 20 meters, perhaps less. But enough that they could no longer hear each other clearly. Enough that they had to shout to be understood. And then the boat disappeared over the horizon. Not literally. The Kaz II was still visible for a long time, a white shape growing smaller and smaller, the sails hanging loose, the engine humming faintly across the water. But it was gone in the way that matters. Out of reach. Beyond saving. The men would have watched it go. They would have understood, in that moment, what had happened. That the boat was not coming back. That no one knew they were in the water. That the nearest land was 50 kilometers away, an impossible distance, and that the odds of another vessel passing close enough to see them were vanishingly small. They would have understood that they were going to die. Hypothermia was not the threat. The water was too warm, but exhaustion was, and dehydration. And the slow, relentless understanding that there was no way out. The human body can survive in water for hours, sometimes days, if conditions are right. But survival requires more than just physical endurance. It requires hope, the belief that rescue is possible, that someone is looking for you, that if you can just hold on a little longer, help will arrive. But no one was looking for them. The Kaz II was not due to check in for another 2 days. The men had no schedule to keep, no obligations. No one waiting for a phone call or a radio transmission. They were simply 3 retirees on a leisurely cruise, and their absence would not be noticed until they failed to arrive at their next planned stop. By then, it would be too late. Peter likely went first, the oldest, the weakest swimmer, the one with arthritis in his knees and shoulders. He would have fought as long as he could, but eventually his body would have betrayed him. His arms would have stopped responding. His legs would have cramped. And the water, patient and indifferent, would have pulled him under. James may have tried to help him, may have swum over, tried to hold his brother's head above the surface, tried to keep him conscious. But you cannot save someone from drowning when you are drowning yourself. Derek would have been the last. Alone in the water, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, knowing that darkness would make survival even less likely. He may have tried to swim toward the coast, may have believed for a while that he could make it. But 50 kilometers is an impossible distance, and eventually he too would have succumbed. The ocean took them quietly, without witnesses, without drama, and the Kaz II sailed on. The helicopter crew saw it first. A coastal patrol flight, routine surveillance over the outer reef, the kind of operation that happens dozens of times a week without incident. The pilot was following a standard grid pattern, scanning the water for debris, illegal fishing vessels, boats in distress. It was April 20th, 2007, mid-morning. The visibility was excellent. And there, approximately 80 kilometers northeast of Townsville, was a catamaran under sail. White hulls gleaming in the sun, moving north at a steady pace. Nothing about it appeared unusual at first. The Great Barrier Reef sees hundreds of recreational vessels during the tourist season. Catamarans are common, popular with cruisers because of their stability and deck space. The pilot noted its position, prepared to move on. Then he noticed the sail. It was shredded. Hanging in tatters from the mast, flapping violently in the wind, the kind of damage that suggests either a storm or serious mishandling. The pilot circled lower, dropping altitude to get a better look. No one was visible on deck. He made another pass, descended to 50 meters. The catamaran continued on its heading, sails deployed, but clearly not under active control. The cockpit was empty. The deck was empty. There was no movement anywhere on the vessel. The pilot radioed it in. Within hours, a rescue vessel was dispatched from Townsville. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority coordinated the response, treating it initially as a possible medical emergency. Perhaps the crew was injured. Perhaps they were below deck, unable to respond to radio calls. Perhaps the damage to the sail had been caused by a sudden gust that had also incapacitated the sailors. But when the rescue team came alongside the Kaz II and called out, no one answered. They boarded carefully, tied their tender to the catamaran's stern rail and climbed aboard, calling for the crew, checking the cockpit, the cabin, the forward deck. The boat was empty, and everything was wrong, in a way that nothing should be wrong. The first thing they noticed was the engine. It was running. Not loudly, just the low, steady hum of a diesel at idle. The kind of background noise that disappears after a few minutes until you stop and actually listen for it. The throttle was in neutral. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. The engine temperature was normal. It had been running, unattended, for at least 2 days. The second thing they noticed was the laptop. It was open on the navigation station, screen glowing, power cable plugged into the boat's 12-volt outlet. The GPS software was active, displaying the catamaran's current position and a track line showing where it had been. The rescuers leaned in, studying the screen, trying to understand what they were looking at. The boat had maintained a near-perfect northerly heading for the past 48 hours, 120 nautical kilometers in a straight line, deviating no more than a few degrees from its programmed course. The autopilot was engaged. One of the rescuers reached for the helm, disengaged the system, and the boat immediately began to wallow, turning broadly into the wind without anyone steering. He re-engaged it, and the catamaran corrected itself, swinging back onto its northerly heading as if nothing had happened. The boat had been sailing itself. They moved through the cabin slowly, cataloguing everything they saw. The table was set. Not elaborately, but deliberately. 2 plates, forks, knives. A half-empty bottle of red wine, the cork resting beside it. The remnants of a meal, partially eaten. Pasta, it looked like. Or rice. Something simple. The kind of thing you prepare quickly when you are hungry and do not want to spend time cooking. The food was dried out, crusted to the plates, but not moldy, not old enough to have been sitting for weeks. A few days, perhaps. No more than that. In the galley, they found more evidence of interrupted routine. A cutting board with a knife beside it, vegetables half chopped, an open can of tomatoes. The refrigerator was still running, keeping the remaining food cold. Milk, cheese, bread that had not yet begun to mold. Everything suggested that the crew had been preparing a meal and had simply stopped. Not hurriedly, not in panic. Just stopped, as if they had been called away and intended to return in a moment. But they had not returned. The sleeping quarters were tidy, bunks made, or at least not disheveled. Personal belongings still in place, wallets, watches, a pair of reading glasses on a shelf. One of the rescuers opened a locker and found it stocked with clothing, neatly folded, shorts, t-shirts, a light jacket. No one had packed. No one had taken anything. The rescuers moved back on deck, checked the life jacket locker. All 6 jackets were still there, untouched. Checked the safety equipment. Flares, fire extinguisher, first aid kit. Everything accounted for. The only thing missing was the dinghy. It should have been secured to the foredeck, tied down and covered. But the space where it belonged was empty. The bungee cords that should have held it in place were hanging loose, still attached to their anchor points, but unhooked. The tarp that had covered it was bunched against the forward rail, as if someone had pulled it off quickly and left it there. The dinghy was gone, and so was the crew. One of the rescuers noticed the fishing line. It was trailing off the stern, disappearing into the water, still attached to a rod that was wedged into a holder on the transom. He pulled on it gently, felt resistance, and began to reel it in. The line was tangled. Not badly, but enough to suggest that it had been pulled tight, wrapped around itself, possibly snagged on something. He worked it free, coiling it carefully, and when he finally brought the end aboard, he saw that the lure was still attached. No fish. Just the lure, slightly bent, the hooks still intact. He set the rod down and looked back at the empty cockpit, trying to piece together what might have happened. A snagged line, a torn sail, an absent crew, a missing dinghy. It did not make sense. If the crew had abandoned the boat, they would have taken supplies. Water, food, the life jackets. They would have called for help on the radio, sent a distress signal, done something to indicate they were in trouble. But the radio was off. The emergency beacon had not been activated. There were no messages left behind, no notes, nothing to explain where the men had gone or why. The boat was intact, seaworthy, running perfectly, and utterly inexplicably abandoned. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority launched a full-scale search operation within hours of the Kaz II being boarded. It was treated as a missing persons case, priority 1, and every available resource was mobilized. 2 helicopters were deployed, flying grid patterns over a search area that eventually expanded to more than 4,000 square nautical miles. Fixed-wing aircraft joined them, equipped with high-resolution cameras and infrared sensors designed to detect body heat in the water. The Coast Guard dispatched 3 vessels, each assigned to a different sector, sweeping the ocean in overlapping lanes. The search focused initially on the area where investigators believed the men had gone overboard. Using the GPS data from the laptop, they calculated the boat's track backward, identifying a point approximately 120 nautical kilometers south of where the Kaz II had been found. This was where the autopilot had likely been engaged. This was where the crew had likely entered the water. But the ocean does not preserve evidence. Currents shift. Winds change direction. A body that enters the water in one location can drift dozens of kilometers in a matter of days, carried by forces that are difficult to predict and impossible to trace. The searchers looked for debris. Life jackets, clothing, the missing dinghy. Anything that might indicate where the men had ended up. They found nothing. By the third day, the search area had expanded to cover nearly 6,000 square nautical miles. Helicopters flew low over the water, pilots scanning the surface for any sign of the crew. Boats zigzagged through the swells, crew members standing on deck with binoculars, searching for shapes that did not belong. Still nothing. On the fifth day, the search was scaled back. Not abandoned, but reduced. The likelihood of finding the men alive had dropped to near zero. The focus shifted from rescue to recovery, and even that seemed increasingly unlikely. The ocean had swallowed them completely. The media seized on the story almost immediately. By the time the search entered its second day, the Kaz II had been dubbed the Ghost Yacht, and the headlines wrote themselves. Journalists descended on Townsville, interviewing anyone with knowledge of the case, filming the catamaran as it sat at the dock, guarded by police while investigators combed through it for clues. The details were too compelling to ignore. The meal on the table, the running engine, the laptop still glowing, the empty boat sailing itself across the ocean like something out of a maritime legend. Comparisons to the Mary Celeste were inevitable. That infamous brigantine, found adrift in the Atlantic in 1872, its crew vanished without explanation, had captivated the public for more than a century. Now it seemed Australia had its own version, but the Mary Celeste had been a merchant vessel, a working ship with cargo, and a professional crew. The Kaz II was a recreational yacht, a floating retirement dream, and the men aboard had not been sailors by trade. They had been ordinary people, friends, retirees who simply wanted to spend a few weeks on the water. That ordinariness made the story more unsettling, because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The theories began almost immediately. Piracy was the first. Remote, but not impossible. The waters of the Great Barrier Reef are not known for pirate activity, but smugglers do operate in the region, moving drugs and contraband between Australia and Papua New Guinea. Perhaps the Kaz II had stumbled across something it should not have seen. Perhaps the crew had been taken, or worse, but there was no evidence. No sign of forced entry. No damage to the boat beyond the torn sail. Nothing stolen. The wallets were still in the cabin. Cash untouched. The navigation equipment was still in place, valuable and easily portable. If pirates had boarded, they had taken nothing. Insurance fraud was another theory. Perhaps Derek Batten had orchestrated the disappearance, arranging for the boat to be found adrift, while he and the Tunstead brothers slipped away to start new lives somewhere else. It was far-fetched, but not unheard of. People had faked deaths for less. Investigators looked into it. They examined Derek's finances, searched for any indication of debt, desperation, motive. They found nothing. Derek was not wealthy, but he was not broke. He owned his house. His retirement accounts were modest, but sufficient. There were no large insurance policies on the boat, no recent financial troubles, no reason to stage an elaborate disappearance. The theory collapsed under scrutiny. Suicide was suggested, quietly, by a few commentators. Perhaps the men had made a pact, had decided to end their lives together, had motored out into the open ocean and jumped overboard. But this, too, made no sense. Why set the table? Why leave the engine running? Why take the dinghy? Suicide is rarely so theatrical, and there was nothing in the backgrounds of the three men to suggest depression or desperation. They were retirees on a sailing trip, not men fleeing from anything. The police forensic team spent 4 days aboard the Kaz II, processing it as a potential crime scene. They photographed everything, documented the position of every object, took fingerprints from the helm, the table, the railings, swabbed surfaces for blood, checked the bilges for hidden compartments, examined the hull for damage that might indicate a collision. They found nothing. No blood, No signs of struggle, no hidden compartments. The hull was intact, free of gouges or scrapes that would suggest the boat had struck a reef or been rammed by another vessel. The torn sail was sent to a laboratory for analysis. Experts examined the fabric, looking for clues about how it had failed. The conclusion was straightforward. The sail had flogged violently in the wind, likely because it had not been properly secured or trimmed, and the repeated snapping against the rigging had caused a seam to tear. It was not a catastrophic failure, just a small rip that had gradually expanded as the sail continued to flog. It was the kind of damage that happens to inexperienced sailors. Common. Avoidable. Not inherently dangerous. The laptop was examined by a digital forensics team. They retrieved the GPS logs, plotted the boat's track on a chart, and confirmed what the initial investigators had suspected. The Kaz II had traveled in a nearly straight line for 48 hours, maintaining a heading of 012 degrees, deviating no more than 5 degrees in either direction. The autopilot had been engaged the entire time. One of the forensic analysts noted something else. The GPS logs showed that the boat had slowed briefly, approximately 48 hours before it was found. The speed had dropped from 6 knots to less than 2, remained there for roughly 10 minutes, and then increased again. Someone had throttled back the engine. This detail suggested that at least one member of the crew had been alive and active at that moment, that they had returned to the helm, adjusted the throttle, and then left again. But why? The analyst could not say. The GPS only recorded position and speed. It did not record what happened on deck. The coroner's inquest was convened 3 months later. It was a formal proceeding, designed to establish the facts of the case as thoroughly as possible and to determine, if possible, the cause of death. Investigators presented their findings. The forensic reports were entered into evidence. The families of the missing men were invited to attend, though most chose not to. The pain was too fresh. The coroner, a man named Michael Barnes, reviewed the evidence carefully. He was methodical, cautious, unwilling to make pronouncements without support. But he was also pragmatic. He understood that the families needed closure, and that closure required a conclusion, even if that conclusion was based on probability rather than certainty. He called expert witnesses, marine safety specialists, search and rescue coordinators, meteorologists who analyzed the weather conditions on April 18th. Each one added a piece to the puzzle. The weather had been calm, not dangerous. Winds of 15 to 20 knots, seas of 1 to 1.5 meters. Conditions that any competent sailor should have been able to handle without difficulty. But the men aboard the Kaz II were not competent sailors. They were enthusiastic amateurs, and amateurs make mistakes. One of the expert witnesses, a sailing instructor with 30 years of experience, was asked to speculate on what might have caused the crew to abandon the boat. He paused, considering his answer carefully. "It's difficult to say with certainty," he began. "But if I had to guess, I would say someone went overboard, probably by accident, leaning over the rail, trying to retrieve something, and losing their balance. Once that happens, the others would have tried to help, and in trying to help, they may have ended up in the water themselves." The coroner asked if that scenario was consistent with the evidence. The instructor nodded. "The missing dinghy suggests someone tried to launch it. The torn sail suggests the boat was not under full control. The fact that the autopilot was engaged suggests the crew may have been distracted, attending to something else, and did not realize the boat would continue sailing without them." Would experienced sailors have made those mistakes? Probably not. But these men were not experienced, and the ocean does not forgive inexperience. The coroner delivered his findings in a written report, published in August 2007. He concluded that Derek Batten, Peter Tunstead, and James Tunstead had most likely drowned on or around April 18, 2007, after entering the water in an attempt to rescue one another. He noted that the exact sequence of events could not be determined with certainty, but that the most plausible scenario involved one man falling overboard, a second man jumping in to assist, and the third man either jumping in deliberately or falling in while attempting to launch the dinghy. He noted that the autopilot had likely been engaged before the emergency began, and that the boat had continued on its programmed heading after the crew entered the water, making it impossible for them to reboard. He noted that none of the men had been wearing life jackets and that this failure had significantly reduced their chances of survival. He noted that there was no evidence of foul play, no indication of third-party involvement, and no reason to suspect that the disappearance had been anything other than a tragic accident. The report was clear, comprehensive, and unsatisfying, because it did not answer the one question that mattered most. Why had the dinghy never been found? The coroner's conclusion rested on a foundation of probability, not proof. One man overboard. A second jumps in. A third follows. The boat sails away. All three drown. It is a clean narrative, logical, supported by the evidence. And yet, like all reconstructions of events without witnesses, it contains gaps. Small spaces where certainty cannot reach, where questions linger. The most likely scenario, the coroner wrote. Not the only scenario, just the most likely. And in those three words lies the entire mystery of the Kaz II. The dinghy remains the central problem. It was not a large vessel. Approximately 3 meters long, inflatable rubber with a wooden floor panel, designed to carry 2 or 3 people at most. Light enough to be launched by a single person, buoyant enough to survive even if swamped. The kind of tender that every cruising yacht carries for trips to shore when anchored offshore. It was missing from the foredeck when the Kaz II was found. The bungee cords that secured it were unhooked but still attached to their anchor points. The tarp that had covered it was bunched at the forward rail, as if pulled off hastily. Someone had launched it, or attempted to, but where had it gone? Search aircraft flew over the area for days, scanning the water for any sign of the small inflatable. They found nothing. Coastal patrols checked beaches along the Queensland coast, looking for debris that might have washed ashore. They found nothing. If the dinghy had capsized, it should have remained afloat. Even waterlogged, even with the floor panel detached, the inflatable chambers would have kept it on the surface. It might have drifted, certainly. Currents could have carried it 100 kilometers from where it was launched. But it should have been found eventually. It was not. One investigator suggested that the dinghy might have deflated, that the rubber chambers had been punctured or degraded by sun exposure, and that once deflated, it had sunk. But this seemed unlikely. The boat was well maintained. Derek Batten had taken pride in keeping his equipment in good condition. A punctured dinghy would have been noticed, repaired, or replaced long before the voyage began. Another investigator proposed that the dinghy had been taken by whoever found it, that a passing fishing vessel or another yacht had come across the small inflatable drifting in the ocean, had pulled it aboard, and had simply kept it. Finders keepers. An unregistered tender, no identification, no way to trace it back to the Kaz II. This too seemed unlikely. The disappearance of the ghost yacht was international news by the time the search began. Any sailor who recovered a dinghy in that area would have known to report it, would have understood its significance, unless they had reasons not to. There are always theories that operate in the margins. Explanations that do not fit the official narrative but cannot be entirely dismissed. Some suggested that the crew had not drowned, that they had climbed into the dinghy and attempted to row to shore, and that they had succeeded in reaching land somewhere remote, somewhere without roads or settlements, and that they were still out there, stranded, waiting for rescue. The Australian coastline is vast. Much of it is uninhabited. It is theoretically possible for someone to come ashore in a place so isolated that they might not be found for weeks or even months. But the men had no supplies. No water, no food, The dinghy had no motor, just a single oar. And the nearest land was 50 kilometers away. Too far to row, especially in deteriorating weather. If they had reached shore, they would have been found. Eventually, they were not. Others suggested something darker, that the men had encountered someone else on the water, another boat, and that this encounter had not ended well. Drug smugglers operate in the waters between Australia and Papua New Guinea. It is a known route, difficult to patrol, profitable for those willing to take the risk. Perhaps the Kaz II had come too close to a smuggling operation. Perhaps the crew had seen something they should not have seen. Perhaps they had been taken aboard another vessel, their own boat left to drift, the dinghy removed to eliminate evidence. But again, the evidence does not support this. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been aboard the catamaran. The belongings were undisturbed. The cash was still in the wallets. If smugglers had taken the crew, why leave everything else behind? And why bother to engage the autopilot? It would have been simpler to scuttle the boat, to sink it and erase all evidence. Instead, the Kaz II was left to sail on, a floating crime scene waiting to be discovered. It makes no sense. Unless the goal was not to hide the disappearance, but to ensure the boat was found. The families were left with fragments. Derek Batten's sister attended the inquest. She sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, listening as investigators described the scene aboard her brother's boat. The meal on the table, the running engine, the empty cockpit. When asked if she had any questions, she shook her head. There was nothing to ask. No question that could bring him back. Peter and James Tunstead had been close, brothers in more than name. They had lived near each other for years, shared hobbies, spent holidays together. Their families had known Derek through them, had attended the barbecues and the dinners, had waved them off when they departed Airlie Beach with promises to send photos and postcards. None ever arrived. The families were offered the official conclusion: accidental drowning. A tragedy born of inexperience and bad luck. They were encouraged to accept it, to find closure, to begin the process of moving forward. Some did, others could not, because closure requires certainty, and certainty requires a body, a grave, something tangible to mark the loss. The ocean does not provide that. It takes and does not return. The Kaz II was eventually sold. It sat at the dock in Townsville for months while the investigation continued, guarded by police tape and public curiosity. Tourists came to photograph it, to stand on the pier and stare at the ghost yacht, to speculate about what had happened aboard it. When the coroner finally released the vessel, Derek's estate handled the sale. The catamaran was cleaned, repaired, the torn sail replaced. It was listed through a broker, described carefully in the advertisement. Well-maintained cruising catamaran, twin diesel engines, recent survey, ideal for coastal cruising. The listing did not mention the disappearance. It did not need to. Every sailor in Australia knew the story. It sold below market value. The new owner, a businessman from Sydney, said he was not superstitious, that a boat was just fiberglass and metal and fabric, that the tragedy had nothing to do with the vessel itself. He renamed it, gave it a new registration, sailed it up the coast without incident, but he never spoke publicly about owning it, never allowed journalists to photograph it, never confirmed the rumors that he had bought the ghost yacht. Some vessels carry their histories like scars, visible, permanent, impossible to erase. The Kaz II was one of them. There is a psychology to ghost ships that transcends the facts. We are drawn to them because they represent a specific kind of horror, not the horror of violence or monsters or supernatural forces, but the horror of interruption, of ordinary life halted mid-sentence. The meal on the table is the detail that haunts, because it suggests normalcy. 3 men sitting down to eat, plates set, wine poured, a conversation in progress, and then, suddenly, nothing. The scene frozen, the people gone. It is the domesticity that unnerves us. If the boat had been found ransacked, damaged, chaotic, we could understand it. We could imagine a storm, a collision, a crisis that explained the abandonment. But the Kaz II was tidy, orderly, a floating home that had simply lost its inhabitants. It is the same quality that made the Mary Celeste famous. Not the fact that the crew disappeared, but the fact that they disappeared from a vessel that showed no signs of distress. Cargo intact. Personal belongings in place. The ship itself sailing on as if nothing had happened. These stories lodge in the imagination because they violate our sense of cause and effect. We expect disasters to leave evidence. Wreckage, blood, damage. Something that explains the absence. When there is no evidence, we fill the gap with speculation. With theories that grow more elaborate, the longer the mystery remains unsolved. And the Kaz II gave us very little evidence. The official investigation closed in late 2007. The coroner's findings were published. The search was suspended. The families were notified. The case was filed away, another maritime tragedy in a long list of maritime tragedies. But it did not disappear from public consciousness. Documentaries were made. Books were written. Online forums dedicated to maritime mysteries debated the details endlessly, dissecting every piece of evidence, proposing new theories, arguing over the likelihood of each scenario. Some believed the official explanation. Others did not. The arguments fell into predictable camps. Those who trusted the investigators, who accepted that accidents happen and that the ocean is unforgiving. And those who believed there was more to the story, that the evidence had been misread or overlooked, that the truth was darker and more complex than anyone wanted to admit. Neither side could prove their case, because proof requires evidence, and evidence requires a body. The ocean had provided neither. There is a maritime principle, older than modern navigation, that speaks to this exact situation. A vessel found adrift with no crew aboard is considered derelict. It belongs to no one. Or rather, it belongs to whoever claims it. Salvage law applies. The finder can take possession, sell it, keep it. The original owner's rights are forfeited the moment the boat is abandoned. But what does it mean to abandon a boat? The legal definition is clear. Intentional relinquishment of possession. A deliberate choice to leave. But the men aboard the Kaz II did not choose to leave. They fell. They jumped. They were pulled into the water by accident and circumstance and the cruel mechanics of a boat sailing itself away from them. Is that abandonment? Or is it something else? Something for which the law has no adequate term. The question matters because it determines what happens next. Who owns the story? Who has the right to speak for the dead? Derek Batten's estate sold the boat, but they could not sell the mystery. That belongs to everyone now. A piece of maritime folklore, a cautionary tale, a ghost story that happens to be true. In the years since, other boats have been found adrift. Other crews have vanished. Other families have been left with questions and no answers. It happens more often than most people realize. The ocean is vast, indifferent, and very good at keeping secrets. A person who goes overboard, even in calm weather, even in clear visibility, is difficult to find. The surface of the water looks uniform from above. A human head, bobbing in the swells, is almost invisible from more than a few hundred meters away. Search and rescue teams do their best. They deploy helicopters, boats, infrared sensors. They calculate drift patterns, account for currents and wind. They search for hours, sometimes days. But the odds are against them. The ocean does not want to give back what it takes, and so the list of missing sailors grows. Names added to a registry that no one wants to join. Men and women who departed port and never returned. Boats found empty, engines running, no explanation. The Kaz II is just one entry in that list, but it remains one of the most haunting because of the meal on the table, because of the laptop still glowing, because of the small perfect details that suggest the crew was coming right back. They did not come back, and we are left to imagine what their final moments were like, whether they understood what was happening, whether they had time to say goodbye to each other, whether they watched the boat sail away and felt despair, or whether it happened too quickly for them to process. We do not know. We will never know. There is a memorial in Perth, a small plaque erected by the families, honouring Derek Batten and Peter and James Tunstead. It stands near the marina where Derek kept the Kaz II before the voyage. Sailors walk past it, sometimes without noticing. Sometimes they stop and read the names, the dates, the brief inscription. Lost at sea. Remembered always. It is a quiet marker. No dramatic monument, no grand statements, just 3 names and a date, and the acknowledgement that they are gone. The ocean does not offer closure. But memorials do. They give us a place to stand, a stone to touch, a physical anchor for grief that otherwise has nowhere to land. The families visit when they can. Leave flowers. Sit for a while. Remember. And in that act of remembering, the men are brought back, briefly, not in body, but in thought, in the stories shared by those who knew them, in the photographs kept in wallets and on mantles. They were not famous. They were not adventurers. They were ordinary men who wanted a few weeks on the water and never came home. That ordinariness is what makes the story resonate, because it could have been anyone, any group of friends, any retirement plan, any dream of sailing into the sun and leaving the world behind for a while. The ocean does not care about your dreams. It does not distinguish between the experienced and the amateur. It takes who it wants, when it wants, and it does not explain itself. The Kaz II is no longer called the Kaz II. The new owner renamed it, as sailors often do when they want to leave the past behind. It sails under a different flag now, a different registration, a different identity. But the story remains. It is told in sailing clubs, in maritime academies, in forums dedicated to safety at sea. It is used as a teaching tool, a cautionary example of what can go wrong when protocols are not followed, when life jackets are not worn, when autopilot is left engaged without someone at the helm. The lessons are practical, concrete, designed to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. But the mystery endures. Because no amount of safety training can explain the dinghy. No protocol can account for the perfect, eerie tableau of the meal on the table and the engine still running. The facts tell us what happened. Probably. But they do not tell us why it feels wrong. Why the scene aboard the Kaz II, reconstructed from photographs and testimony, continues to unsettle anyone who looks at it closely. It is the feeling that something is missing. Not just the crew, but some essential piece of information that would make everything else make sense. We search for that piece. We theorize. We debate. We construct elaborate explanations that fill the gaps in the official narrative. And the ocean remains silent. If you sail the waters off the Great Barrier Reef today, you might pass the place where the Kaz II was found. There is no marker, no buoy, nothing to indicate that anything happened there. The water looks the same as it always has. Blue, calm, indifferent. Somewhere beneath the surface, perhaps, are the remains of 3 men who drowned trying to save each other. Or perhaps the current carried them far away, scattered them across hundreds of kilometers, left them in places where they will never be found. We do not know. And the ocean is not telling. The Kaz II remains one of the strangest maritime disappearances of the 21st century. Not because of what happened, but because of what did not happen. No violence, no storm, no obvious catastrophe. Just 3 men and a boat, and the slow mechanical cruelty of an autopilot that kept sailing long after there was no one left to steer. It is a ghost story, a true one, The kind that stays with you because it is built from ordinary materials. A meal, a fishing line, a moment of inattention, and the ocean, patient and indifferent, waiting for the mistake. It always does.